Alright, folks, welcome back to Paper Cuts. Last week we finished up the colors of space, and this week we're going to be, starting in on a new story called The Sound of Silence. So, let's begin on that. Excuse me. Nobody at Hoskins, Haskell, and Chapman Incorporated knew just why Lucilia Brown, G.G. Hoskins' secretary, came to work a half hour early every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Even G.G. himself had he been asked, would have had trouble explaining how his occasional exasperated wish that just once somebody would reach the office ahead of him could have caused his attractive young secretary to start doing so 3 times a week, or kept her at it all the months since that first gloomy March day. Nobody asked G.G., however, not even Paul Chapman, the very junior partner in the advertising firm, who had displayed more than a little interest in Lucilia all fall and winter, but very little interest in anything all spring and summer. Nobody asked Lucilia why she left early on the days she arrived early. After all, 8 hours is long enough, and certainly nobody knew where Lucilia went at 4:30 on those 3 days, nor would anybody in the office have believed it, had he known. "Lucky Brown seeing a psychiatrist?" The typist would have giggled, the office boy would have snorted, and every salesman on the force would have guffawed. Even Paul Chapman might have managed a small wry smile. A real laugh had been beyond him for several months, ever since he had asked Lucilia confidently, "Will you marry me?" And she answered, "I'm sorry, Paul. Thanks, but no thanks." Not that seeing a psychiatrist was anything to laugh at in itself. After all, the year was 1962, and there were almost as many serious articles about mental health as there were cartoons about psychoanalysts, even in the magazines that specialized in poking fun. In certain cities, including Los Angeles, and in certain industries, especially advertising, "I have an appointment with my psychiatrist" was a perfectly acceptable excuse for leaving work early. The idea of a secretary employed by the largest advertising firm in one of the best-known suburbs of the sprawling city of Angels doing so should not, therefore, have seemed particularly odd, and nor would it have if the person had been anyone at all except Lucilia Brown. The idea that she might need aid of any kind, particularly psychiatric, was patently ridiculous. She had been born 22 years earlier, in undisputed possession of a sizable silver spoon, and she was, in addition, bright, beautiful, and charming, with 20/20 vision, perfect teeth, a father and a mother who adored her, friends who did likewise, and the kind of luck you'd have to see to believe. Other people entered contests. Lucilia won them. Other people drove 5 miles over the legal speed limit and got caught doing it. Lucilia outdistanced them, but fortuitously slowed down just before the highway patrol appeared from nowhere. Other people waited in the wrong line at the bank, while the woman ahead of them learned how to roll pennies. Lucilia was always in the line that moved right up to the teller's window. Lucky was not, in other words, just a happenstance abbreviation of Lucilia. It was also an exceedingly apt nickname. And Lucky Brown's co-workers would have been quite justified in laughing at the very idea of her being unhappy enough about anything to spend 3 precious hours a week stretched out on a brown leather couch, staring miserably at its pale blue ceiling and fumbling for words that refused to come to her. There were a good many days when Lucilia felt like laughing at the idea herself, and there were other days when she didn't even feel like smiling. Wednesday, the 25th of July, was one of the days when she didn't feel like smiling, or talking, or moving. It had started out badly when she opened her eyes and found herself staring at a familiar blue ceiling. "I know," she said irritably. "I tell you, I simply don't know what happens. I'll start to answer someone and the words will be right on the tip of my tongue, all ready to be spoken, and then I'll say something altogether different. Or I'll start to cross the street and for no reason at all be unable to step off the curb even." "For no reason at all? Are you sure you aren't withholding something you ought to tell me?" She shifted a little, suddenly uncomfortable, and then she was fully awake and the ceiling was ivory, not blue. She stared at it for a long moment, completely disoriented, before she realized that she was in her own bed, not on Dr. Andrews' brown leather couch, that the conversation had been another of the indeterminable imaginary dialogues she found herself carrying on with the psychiatrist, day and night, awake and asleep. "Get out of my dreams," she ordered crossly, summoning up a quick mental picture of Dr. Andrews' expressive face, level gray eyes, and silvering temples, the better to banish him from her thoughts. She was immediately sorry she had done so, for the image remained fixed in her mind. She could almost feel his eyes, as she heard his voice ask again, "For no reason at all, Lucilia?" The weatherman had promised to scorch her, and the heat that already lay like a blanket over the room made it seem probable that that promise would be fulfilled. She moved listlessly, showering, patting herself until dry, lingering over the choice of a dress until her mother called urgently from the kitchen. She was long minutes behind schedule when she left the house. Usually she rather enjoyed easing her small car into the stream of automobiles, pouring down Civilpetta toward the San Diego freeway, jockeying for position, shifting expertly from one lane to another to take advantage of every break in the traffic. This morning she only felt angry impatience. She choked back the irritated impulse to drive directly into the side of a car that cut across in front of her, held her horn button down furiously when a slow-starting truck hesitated fractionally after the light had turned green. When she finally edged her Renault up onto the on-ramp and the freeway stretched straight and unobstructed ahead, she stepped down on the accelerator and watched the needle climb up and past the legal 65-mile limit. The sound of her tires on the smooth concrete was soothing, and the rush of wind outside gave the morning an illusion of coolness. She edged away from the tangle of cars that had pulled onto the freeway with her, and momentarily was alone on the road with her rear-view mirror blank, the oncoming lands bare, and a small rise shutting off the world ahead. And that was when it happened. "Get out of the way!" a voice shrieked. "Out of the way, out of the way, out of the way!" Her heart lurched, her stomach twisted convulsively, and there was a brassy taste in her mouth. Instinctively, she stamped down on the brake pedal, swerved sharply into the outer lane, and by the time she'd topped the rise, she was going a cautious 50 miles an hour and hugging the far edge of the freeway. Then and only then did she hear the squeal of agonized tires and saw the cumbersome semi-trailer coming from the opposite direction rock dangerously, jackknife into the dividing posts that separated north and southbound traffic, crunch ponderously through them, and crash to a stop several 100 feet ahead of her, and squarely athwart the lane down which she had been speeding only seconds earlier. The highway patrol materialized within minutes. Even so, it was after 8 by the time Lucilia gave them their statement, agreed for the umpteenth time with the shaken but uninjured truck driver that it was indeed fortunate she hadn't been in the center lane, and drove slowly to the remaining miles to the office. The gray mood of the early morning had changed to black, and now there were two voices in her mind competing for attention. "I knew it was going to happen," the truck driver said. "I couldn't see over the top of that hill. All I could do was fight the wheel and pray if anybody was coming he'd get out of the way." She could almost hear him repeating the words, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." And right on the heel of his cry came Dr. Andrews' soft query, "For no reason at all, Lucilia?" She pulled into the company parking lot, jerked the wheel savagely to the left, and slammed on the brakes. Shut up, both of you." She started into the building and then hesitated. She was already late, but there was something. Get out of the way, for no reason at all. She yielded to the impulse and walked hurriedly downstairs to the basement library. That stuff I asked you to get together for me by tomorrow, Ruthie," she said to the gray-haired librarian. "You wouldn't by chance have already done it, would you?" "Funny you should ask." The elderly woman bobbed down behind the counter and popped back up with an armload of magazines and newspapers. "Just happened to have some free time last thing yesterday. It's already charged out to you, so you just go right ahead and take it, dearie." It was 8:30 when Lucilla finally reached the office. When I need you, where are you? Learned last night that the top dog of the Kerry Carton Corporation is in town today, so they pushed that conference up from Friday to 10 this morning. If you'd been here early, or even on time, we might at least have gotten some of the information together. Lucilia laid the stack of material on his desk. I haven't had time to flag the pages yet, but they're listed on the library request on top. We did 19 ads for KK last year, and 3 of them were premium offers. I stopped by sales on my way in. Susie's digging out figures for you now. Well, so that's where you've been. You could have at least let me know. There was grudging approval beneath his gruffness. Say, how do you know I needed this today anyhow? I didn't, said Lucilia, putting her purse away and whisking off the cover off her typewriter. Happenstance, that's all. Just happened to go down to the library, for no reason at all. Withholding something. Get out of the way. The telephone's demand for attention overrode her thoughts, and she reached toward almost gratefully. Mr. Hoskins' office? Yes, he knows about the 10 o'clock meeting this morning. Thank you for calling anyway. She hung up and glanced at Gigi, but he was so immersed in one of the magazines that the ringing telephone hadn't even disturbed him. Ringing? The last thing she did before she left the office each night was to set the lever in the instrument's base to off, so that the bell wouldn't disturb Gigi if he worked late. So far, nobody had set it back to on. It's getting worse, she said miserably to the pale blue ceiling. The phone didn't ring this morning. It couldn't have, but I answered it. Dr. Andrews said nothing at all. She let her eyes flicker sidewise, but he was outside her range of vision. I don't like having you sit where I can't see you. Freud may have thought it was a good idea, but I think it's a lousy one. She clenched her hands and stared at nothing, and the silence stretched thinner and thinner, like a balloon blown big, until the temptation to rupture it was too great to resist. I didn't see the truck this morning, nor did I hear it. There was no reason at all for me to slow down and pull over. You might be dead if you hadn't. Would you like that better? The matter-of-fact question was like a hand laid across Lucilia's mouth. I don't want to be dead, but neither do I want to go on like this, hearing words that aren't spoken and bells that don't ring. When it gets to the point that I pick up a phone just because somebody's thinking. She stopped abruptly. I didn't quite catch the end of that sentence, Andrews said. I didn't quite finish it. I can't. Can't? Oh, won't. Don't hold anything back, Lucilia. You were saying that you picked up the phone just because somebody was thinking? He paused expectantly, and Lucilia reread the ornate letters on the framed diploma on the wall, and looked critically at the picture of Miss Andrews, whom she hadn't met, and her impish daughter, whom she had met, and counted the number of pleats in the billowing drapes, ran a tentative finger over the face of her rich wristwatch, straightened a fold of her skirt, and could stand the silence no longer. All right. The girl at Carey Carton thought about talking to me, and I heard my phone ring, even though the phone was disconnected. Gigi thought about needing backup material for the conference, and I went to the library. The truck driver thought about warning people, and I got out of his way, so I can read people's minds, some of the time anyway. Only there's no such thing as telepathy, and if I'm not telepathic, then... She caught herself in the brink of time and bit back the final word, fighting for self-control. Then what? The peremptory question toppled Lucilia's defenses. I'm crazy. Speaking the word released all the others dammed up behind it. Ever since I can remember, things like this have happened. All at once, in the middle of doing something or saying something, I'd find myself thinking about what somebody else was doing or saying. Not thinking, but knowing. I'd be playing hide and seek, and I could see the places where the other kids were hiding, just as plainly as I could see my own surroundings. Or I'd be worrying over the answers to an exam question, and I'd know that somebody in the back of the room had decided to write down, or what the teacher was expecting us to write. Not always, but it happened often enough that it bothered me, just the way it does now when I answer questions before they've been asked, or know what the driver ahead of me is going to do a split second before he does it, or win a bridge game because I can see almost everybody's hand through his own eyes, almost. Has this always bothered you, Lucilia? No. She drew the word out, considering, trying to think when it was that she hadn't felt uneasy about the unexpected moments of perceptiveness. When she was very little, perhaps. She thought of the tiny, laughing girl in the faded snaps of the old album, and suddenly, inexplicably, she was that self, moving through remembered rooms, pausing to collect a word from a boyish father, a thought from a pretty young mother. Reluctantly, she closed her eyes against that distant time. Way back, when I didn't know any better, I just took it for granted that people sometimes talk to each other, that sometimes they pass thoughts along without putting them into words. I was about 6, I guess, when I found out that wasn't so. She slipped into her 6-year-old self as easily as she'd donned the younger Lucilia. This time she wasn't in a house, but high on a hillside, walking on springy pine needles instead of prosaic carpet. "Do talk," Andrews reminded her, his voice so soft that it could have come from inside her own mind. "We were picnicking, a whole lot of us. Somehow I wandered away from the others. One minute the hill was bright with sun, and the next it was deep in shadows, and the wind that had been merely cool was downright cold." She shivered and glanced around, expecting her mother to be somewhere near, holding out a sweater or jacket. There was no one at all in sight, and even then she never thought of being frightened. She turned to retrace her steps. There was a big tree that looked familiar, and a funny rock behind it, half buried in the hillside. She was trudging toward it, humming under her breath when the worried thoughts began to reach her. Only a little creek, so I don't think she could have fallen in. Not really any bears around here, but she never gets hurt. Creek, bear, twisted ankle, dark, cold. She'd veered from her course and started in the direction of the first thought, but now they were coming from all sides, and she had no idea at all which way to go. She ran wildly, then first one way, and then the other, sobbing and calling out. "Lucilia!" The voice sliced into the night, and the dark mountainside and the frightened child were gone. She shuddered a little, reminiscently, and put her hand over her eyes. "Somebody found me, of course, and then Mother was holding me and crying, and I was crying too, and telling her how all the different thoughts at once frightened me and mixed me up. She scolded me for telling fibs, and said that nobody except crazy people thought they could read each other's minds." "I see. So you tried not to, of course. And any time you did it again, or so you thought you did, you blamed it on coincidence or luck." "And that nightmare again." "Yes, that too. Let me tell you about it." "I already have. I've already told you over and over." "Then tell me again, then." "I feel like a fool repeating myself," she complained, but Dr. Andrews made no comment. "Oh, all right. It always starts with me walking down a crowded street, surrounded by honking cars and yelling newsboys and talking people. The noise bothers me, and I'm tempted to cover it ears to shut it out, but instead I just try to ignore it instead, and walk past. The people I pass are smaller, fewer, and noise less. All at once I discover there's nothing around at all but the spreading carpet of gray-green moss, and a silence that feels as old as the chime itself. There's nothing to frighten me, but I am frightened, and lonesome. Not so much for people, but for a sound, any sound. I turned to run back toward town, but there's nothing behind me now, except the same gray moss and gray sky, and dead silence." By the time she reached the last word, her throat had tightened until speaking was difficult. She reached out blindly for something to cling to, and her groping hand met Dr. Andrews, and his warm fingers closed reassuringly around hers. Gradually, the panic drained away, but she could think of nothing to say at all, although she longed to have the silence broken. As if he sensed her longing, Dr. Andrews said, "You started having the dream more often just after you told Paul you wouldn't marry him, is that right?" "No, it was the other way around. I hadn't had it for months, not since I fell in love with him, and then he got assigned to that Witch Tomorrow show, and he started calling me Lucky, the way everybody does, and the dream came back." She stopped short and turned on the couch to stare at the psychiatrist with startled eyes. But that can't be how it was. The lonesomeness, it must have started after I decided to not marry him, not before. I wonder why the dream stopped when you fell in love with him. That's easy, Lucilia said promptly, grasping at the chance to evade her own more disturbing question. I felt close to him, whether he was with me or not, the way I used to feel close to people back when I was a little girl, before that day in the mountains when Mother said... And that's when you started having the dream, wasn't it? How did you know? I didn't, not until just now. But yes, that's what it started. I never minded the dark or being alone, but I was frightened when Mother shut the door that night because the walls seemed so solid, now that I knew all the thoughts I used to think were with me there just were pretend. When I finally went to sleep, I dreamed, and I went on having the same dream night after night after night after night, until finally they called me a doctor, and he gave me something to make me sleep. I wish they'd called me. What could you have done? The sleeping pills worked anyway. And after a while, I didn't need them anymore, because I heard other kids talking about having hunches, lucky streaks, and I stopped feeling different from the rest of them, except once in a while when I was so lucky it bothered me. And after you met Paul, you stopped being too lucky, and the dream stopped? No, it wasn't like that at all, and you'd know it if you'd been listening. With Paul, I felt close to him all the time, no matter how many walls or miles were between us, or anything else for that matter. We hardly had to talk at all because we seemed to know just what the other one was thinking all the time, listening to music, or watching the waves pound in, or just working together at the office. Instead of feeling odd when I knew what he was thinking or what he was going to say, I felt good about it, because I was so sure it was the same way with him and what I was thinking. We didn't need to talk about it. There just wasn't any need to. And she lapsed into silence again. Dr. Andrews straightened her clenched hand out and stroked the fingers gently, and after a moment she went on. He hadn't asked me to marry him, but I knew he would, and there wasn't any hurry, because everything was so perfect anyway. Then one of the company's clients decided to sponsor a series of fantasy shows on TV and wanted to tie in the ads for next year with a fantasy theme. Oh, Paul was assigned to the account, and Gigi let him borrow me to work on it because it was such a rush project, you know. I'd always liked fairy stories when I was little, and when I discovered there were grown-up ones too, like those in Unknown Worlds and the old Weird Tales, I read them too. But I hadn't had any idea how much there was until we started buying copies of everything there was on the newsstands, and then ransacking musty little stores for back issues, and the ones that had gone out of publication, until Paul's office was just full of teetery piles of gaudy magazines, and everywhere you looked there were pictures of strange stars and eight-legged monsters and men in spacesuits. So what do the magazines have to do with you and Paul? The way he felt about them, it changed everything. He just laughed at the ones about spaceships and other planets and robots and things, but he didn't laugh when he came across stories, well, about mutants and people with talents. Talents like reading minds, you mean? She nodded, not looking at him. He didn't laugh at those. He acted as if they were, well, indecent, the sort of thing you wouldn't be caught dead reading in public. And he thought that way too, especially about the stories that even mentioned telepathy. At first, when he brought them to my attention in that disapproving way, I thought he was just pretending to sneer, to tease me, because we knew they could be true. Only his thoughts matched his remarks. He hated the stories, Dr. Andrews, and was just determined to have me hate them too. All at once I began to feel as if I didn't know him at all, and I began to wonder as if I'd just imagined everything all those months I felt so close to him. Then I began to dream again and to think about that lonesome, silent world, even when I was wide awake. Go on, Lucilla. That's all, just about. We finished the job and got rid of the magazines, and for a little while it was almost as if those 2 weeks had never been, except I couldn't forget that he didn't know what I was thinking at all, even when everything he did almost made it seem as if he did. It began to seem wrong for me to know what he was thinking. Crazy, like Mother had said, and worse somehow. Not even nice, if you know what I mean. And then he asked you to marry him. And I said no even when I wanted, oh, so terribly to say yes and yes and yes. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, to hold back a rush of tears. Time folded back on itself. Once again the hands of her wristwatch pointed to 4:30, and the white-clad receptionist said briskly, "The doctor will see you now." Once again, from some remote vantage point, Lucilia watched herself brush past Dr. Andrews and cross to the familiar couch, heard herself say it's getting worse, and watched herself move through a flickering montage of scenes, from childhood to womanhood, from past to present, and she opened her eyes to meet those of the man who sat partially beside her. You see, he said, telling me wasn't so difficult after all. And then, before she had decided on a response, "What do you know about Darwin's theory of evolution, Lucilla?" His habit of ending a tense moment by making an irrelevant query no longer even startled her. Obediently, she fumbled for an answer. "Not much. Just that he thought all the different kinds of life on Earth today evolved from a few blobs of protoplasm that sprouted wings or grew fur, developed teeth, depending on when they lived and where." She paused hopefully, but was met with only silence. "Sometimes what seemed like a step forward wasn't," she said, ransacking her brain for scattered bits of information. "Then the species died out, like the saber-toothed tiger, with those tusks that kept right on growing until they locked his jaws shut, so he starved to death." As she spoke, she remembered the huge beast as he'd been pictured in one of her college textbooks. The recollection grew more and more vivid until she could see both the picture and the facing page of text. There was an irregularly shaped ink blot in the upper corner, and several heavily underlined sentences that stood out so distinctly she could actually read the words. "According to Darwin, variations in general are not infinitesimal, but in the nature of specific mutations. Thousands of these occur, but only the fittest survive the climate, the times, natural enemies, and their own kind, who strive to perpetuate themselves unchanged." Taken one by one, the words were familiar, but taken as a whole, they kind of made no sense at all. She let the book slip unheeded from her mind and stared at Dr. Andrews in bewilderment. "Try saying it in a different way." "You sound like a school teacher humoring a stupid child." And then, because of the habit of obedience was strong, "I guess he meant that tails didn't grow an inch at a time, the way the dogs got cut off, but all at once. Like a fish being born with legs as well as fins, or a baby saber-tooth showing up among tigers with regular teeth, or one ape in a tribe discovering he could swing down out of the treetops and stand erect and walk alone." He echoed her last words. "And walk alone." A premonitory chill traced its way down Lucilla's backbone, and for a second she stood on grey moss under a grey sky in the midst of a grey silence. "He not only could walk alone, he had to. Do you remember what your book said?" "Only the fittest survive, because they have to fight the climate and their natural enemies, and their own kind." She swung her feet to the floor and pushed herself into a sitting position. I'm not a mutation. I'm not, and you can't say I am because I won't listen." "I didn't say you were." There was the barest... Or I didn't say you were. There was the barest hint of emphasis on the first word, and Lucilla was almost certain she heard a whisper of laughter, but he met her gaze blandly, his expression completely serious. "Don't you dare laugh. There's nothing funny about being able to read people's minds. You'd much rather have me offer some other explanation for the occurrences that bother you so. Is that it?" "I guess so. Yes, it is. A brain tumor, or the schizophrenia, or anything at all that could maybe be cured, so I could marry Paul and have children and be like everybody else. Like you." She looked past him to the picture on his desk. "It's easy for you to talk." And he ignored that last statement. Why can't you get married anyway?" "You've already said why. Because Paul would hate me. Everyone would hate me if they knew what I was different." "How would they know? It doesn't show. Now, if you had 3 legs, or a long bushy tail, or outsized teeth." Lucilla smiled involuntarily, and then was furious at herself for doing so. and at Dr. Andrews for provoking her into it. "This whole thing is utterly asinine anyhow. Here we are talking as if I might really be a mutant, and you know perfectly well that I'm not." "Do I? You made the diagnosis, Lucilla, and you've given me some mighty potent reasons for believing it. Can you give me equally good reasons for doubting that you're a telepath?" The peremptory demand left Lucilla speechless for a moment. She groped blindly for an answer, then almost laughed aloud as she found it. "But of course, I almost missed it even after you practically drew me a diagram. If I could read minds just as soon as anybody found it out, you'd be afraid of me or hate me like the book said, and you said, too. If you believed it, you'd do something like having me locked up in a hospital, maybe, instead of—" "Instead of what, Priscilla?" "Instead of being patient and nice and helping me see how silly I've been." She reached out impulsively to touch his hand and then withdrew her own, feeling somewhat foolish when he made no move to respond. Her relief was too great, however, to be contained in silence. "Way back the first time I came in almost, you said that before we finished therapy, you'd know me better than I knew myself. I didn't believe you. Maybe I didn't want to, but I began to think that you were right. Lots of times lately, you've answered a question before I've even asked it. Sometimes you haven't even bothered to answer. You've just sat there in your big brown chair, and I've lain here on the couch, and we've gone through something together, without using words at all." She'd started out almost gaily, the words spilling over each other in their rush to be said, but bit by bit she'd slowed down and then faltered to a stop. After she'd stopped talking altogether, she could still hear the last few phrases, repeated over and over like an echo that refused to die. "Answered before I even asked, without using words at all, without using words." She could almost taste the terror that clogged her throat and dried her lips. "You do believe it, and you could have me locked up. Only... Fragments of thought, splinters of words, and droplets of silence spun into a kaleidoscopic jumble, shifted infinitesimally, and fell into an incredible new pattern. Understanding displaced terror and was, in turn, displaced by indignation. She stared accusingly at her interrogator. "But you look just like everybody else." "You expected perhaps 3 legs, or a long bushy tail, or teeth like that textbook tiger?" "And you're a psychiatrist." "What else? Would you have talked to me like this across a grocery counter, Lucilla? Or listened to me if I'd been driving a bus or filling a prescription? Would I have found the others in a bowling alley or a business office?" "Then there are others?" She let out her breath in a long sigh, involuntarily glancing again at the framed picture. "Only I love Paul, and he can't." "Nor can Carol." His eyes were steady on hers, and yet she felt as if he were looking through and beyond her. For no reason at all, she strained her ears for the sound of footsteps or the summons of a voice. "Where do you suppose the second little blob of protoplasm with legs came from? And the third? If that ape who found he could stand erect had walked lonesomely off into the sunset like a second-rate actor on a late show, where do you suppose he'd be today?" He broke off abruptly and watched Lucilla as the office door edged open. The small girl who inched her way around it wore blue jeans and a ponytail, rather than the organdy frock and curls, but her pixie smile matched that of the girl in the photograph Lucilla had glanced at again and again. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, when she looked toward Lucilla. "I thought you'd like to meet someone with the same nickname as yours," Dr. Andrews said, rising to greet her. "Lucky, meet Lucky." "Hello," the child said, and then her smile widened. "Hello. But I don't have to say it, do I? I can talk to you just the way I talk to Dad and Uncle Whitney and Big Bill." Hello yourself." This time, when the corners of her mouth began to tick upward, she made no attempt to stop them. "Of course you can, darling, and I can answer you the same way, and you'll hear me." Dr. Andrews reached for the open pack of cigarettes on his desk. Is this a private... If is this... Blah, 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 blah. He forgot how to speak English for a second. No, that was just me. Is this a strictly private conversation, girls, or can I get in on it as well? It's impolite to interrupt, Father. Well, he's not exactly interrupting. It was his conversation to begin with. Dr. Andrews' receptionist paused briefly beside the still open office door. None of them heard the gentle rap or soft click of the latch slipping into place when she pushed the door shut, and neither did she hear them. All right. That was the sound of silence. A little shorter than usual. It's all of a half episode. That's not even half of an episode. We're usually here for 2 hours. Aren't we? I have such dreadful trouble with time, you know. Let's see if I can find another short story we can hop into. Let's say The Day Time Stopped Moving. Fair warning, this one's going to open with some very heavy subject matter, but it will pretty immediately pick up into something a little more suitable for this sort of thing. As I've read this one before, and I figured you all would like to see it too. This is The Day Time Stopped Moving. All Dave Miller wanted to do was to end things in peace. He tried, but the things that happened after he'd pulled the trigger were all wrong. Like everyone standing around like statues. No St. Peter, no Pearlygate, no pitchforks or halos. He might just as well have saved the bullet. Dave Miller would never have done it had he been in his right mind. The Millers were not a melancholy stock, hardly the sort of people you expect to read about in the morning paper, who had taken their lives the night before, but Dave Miller was drunk, abominably, roaringly so, and the barrel of the big revolver as he stood against the sink made a ring of coldness against his right temple. Dawn was beginning to stain the frosty kitchen windows, and in the faint light the letter lay a grey square against the drainboard tiles. With a melodramatic gesture of the very drunk, Miller had scrawled across the envelope, "This is why I did it." He'd found Helen's letter in the envelope when he'd staggered into their bedroom 15 minutes ago at 5:15. As had frequently happened during the past year, he'd come home from the store a little late, about 12 hours late, in fact. And this time, Helen had done what she'd long threatened to do. She'd left him. The letter was brief, containing a world of heartbreak and broken hopes. "I don't mind having to scrimp, Dave. No woman minds that if she feels she's really helping her husband over a rough spot. When business went bad a year ago, I told you I was ready to help in any way I could, but you haven't let me. You quit fighting when things got difficult, and you put all your money and energy in on liquor and horses and cards. I could stand being married to a drunkard, Dave, but not a coward." So she was trying to show him. But Miller told himself that he'd show her instead. Coward, huh? Maybe this'd teach her a lesson. Heck of a lot of help she'd been, nagging him every time he took a drink, holler bloody murder when he put $25 on a horse, with a chance to make $500. What man wouldn't do those things? His drugstore was on the skids. Could he be blamed for drinking a little too much if alcohol dissolved the morbid vapors of his mind? Miller stiffened angrily and tightened his finger on the trigger, but he had one moment of frank insight just before the hammer dropped and brought the world tumbling about his ears. It brought with it a realization that the whole thing was his fault. Helen was right. He was a coward. There was a poignant ache in his heart. She'd been as loyal as they came, he knew that. He could have spent his nights thinking up new business tricks instead of swilling whiskey. Could have gone out of his way to be pleasant to customers, not snap at them when he had a terrific hangover. And even Miller knew nobody ever made any money on the horses, at least not when he needed it. But horses and whiskey and business had become tragically confused in his mind, So here he was, full of liquor and madness, with a gun to his head. Then anger swept his mind clean of reason, and he threw his chin up and gripped the gun tight. "Run out on me, will she? Well, this'll show her." In the next moment the hammer fell, and Dave Miller had shown her. Or so he thought. Miller opened his eyes with a start. As plain as black on white, he'd heard a bell ring. The most familiar sound in the world, too. It was the unmistakable tinkle of his cash register. Now, how the thought began in his mind, and then he saw where he was. The cash register was right in front of him. It was open, and on the marble slab lay a customer's 5-spot. Miller's glanced straight up and around him. He was behind the drug counter, all right. There were a man and a girl sipping cokes at the fountain to his right, and the magazine racks by the open door, a tobacco counter across from the fountain, and right before him was a customer. Good heavens, he thought, was this all a dream? Sweat oozed out of his clammy forehead, that stuff of Herman's that he'd drunk during the game. It had had a rank taste, but he wouldn't have thought anything short of marijuana could produce such hallucinations as he just had. Also, I need to note how they spelled marijuana. It's literally spelled like marijuana with an H. Oh, man. Oh, these vintage books. They got good stuff. Wild conjectures came boiling up from the bottom of Miller's being. How did he get behind the counter? Who was the woman he was waiting on? What? The woman's curious stare was just what jarred him completely into the present. Get rid of her was his one thought, then sit down behind the scenes and try to figure it all out. His hand was poised over the cash drawer, and then he remembered he didn't know how much he was to take out of the 5, and avoiding the woman's glance, he muttered, let's see, that was, how much did I say? And the woman made no answer. Miller cleared his throat and said uncertainly, I beg your pardon, ma'am, did I say 75 cents? It was just a feeler, but the woman didn't even answer to that. And it was right then that Dave Miller noticed the deep silence that brooded in the store. Slowly his head came up, and he looked straight into the woman's eyes. She returned him a cool, half-smiling glance, but her eyes neither blinked nor moved. Her features were frozen, lips parted, teeth showing a little. The tip of her tongue was between her even white teeth, as though she had started to say this, and stopped with the syllable unspoken. Muscles began to rise behind Miller's ears. He could flee. He could feel his hair stiffen like filings drawn to a magnet. His glance struggled to the soda fountain, and what he saw there shook him to the core of his being. The girl who was drinking a Coke had the glass to her lips, but apparently she wasn't sipping the liquid. Her boyfriend's glass was on the counter, and he'd drawn on a cigarette and exhaled the gray smoke. That smoke hung in the air like a large, elongated balloon, with a small end disappearing between his lips. When Miller stared, the smoke didn't stir in the slightest. There was something unholy, something supernatural about this scene, and with apprehension rippling down his spine, Dave Miller reached across the cash register and touched the woman on the cheek. The flesh was warm, but hard as flint. Tentatively, the young druggist pushed harder, finally, and shoved with all his might. For all his result, the woman might have been a 2-ton bronze statue. She neither budged nor changed expression. Panic seized Miller, and his voice had a high, hysterical tenor as he called to his soda jerker. Pete! Pete! What in heaven's name is wrong here? The blond youngster with a towel wadded in a glass didn't stir. Miller rushed from the back of the store, seized the boy by the shoulders, and tried to shake him. But Pete was rooted to the spot. And Miller knew now that what was wrong was something greater than a hallucination or a hangover. He was in some kind of trap. His first thought was to rush home and see if Helen was there. There was a great sense of relief when he thought of her. Helen, with her grave blue eyes and understanding manner, would listen to him and know what was the matter. He left a haunted drugstore at the run, and darted around the corner and up the street to his car. But though he had not locked the car, the door resisted his twisting grasp. Shaking, pounding, and swearing, Miller wrestled with each of the doors, and abruptly he stiffened as a horrible thought leapt into his being. His gaze left the car and wandered up the street, past the intersection, past the one beyond that, on up through the thoroughfare, until the gray haze of the city dimmed everything, and as far as Dave Miller could see, there was no trace of motion. Cars were poised in the street, some passing other machines, some turning corners. A streetcar stood at a safety zone. A man who had leapt from the bottom step hung in space a foot above the pavement. Pedestrians paused with one foot up, and a bird hovered above a telephone pole, its wings glued to the blue vault of the sky. With a choked sound, Miller began to run. He didn't slacken his pace for 15 minutes, until around him were the familiar, reassuring trees and shrub-bordered houses of his own street, and yet how strange to them. The season was autumn, and the air filled with brown and golden leaves that tossed on a frozen wind. Miller ran by two boys lying on a lawn, petrified into a modern counterpart of the sculptors, the wrestlers. The sweetish tang of burning leaves brought a thrill of terror to him, as before looking down an alley from whence the smoke drifted, he saw a man tending to a fire whose leaping flames were red tongues that didn't move. Sobbing with relief, the young druggist darted up his own walk, and he tried the front door, found it locked, and jammed a thumb against the doorbell. But of course the little metal button was as immovable as a mountain. So in the end, after convincing himself that the key could not be inserted into the lock, he sprang toward the back. The screen door wasn't latched, but it might as well have been the steel door of a bank vault. Miller began to pound on it, shouting, "Helen! Helen, are you in there? My God, dear, there's something wrong. You've got to—" The silence that flowed in again when his voice choked off was the dead stillness of a tomb. He could hear his voice rustling through the empty rooms, and at last it came back to him like a taunt. "Helen! Helen!" Chapter 2. Time Stands Still. If you've been waiting to come back, now would be a good time. You're in the clear until, I suppose, the end of the story, as I recall. So, let's continue. For Dave Miller, the world was now a planet of death on which he alone lived and moved and spoke. Staggered, utterly beaten, he made no attempt to break into his home, but he did stumble around the kitchen window and try to peer in, anxious to see if there was a body on the floor. The room was in semi-darkness, however, and his straining eyes made out nothing. He returned to the front of the house, shambling like a somnambulist. Seated on the porch steps, head in hands, he slipped into a hell of regrets. He knew now that what he'd done was no hallucination. He was dead, all right. This must be some sort of hell, or at least a purgatory. Bitterly, he cursed his drinking that had led him to do what he'd done. Such a madness. He, Dave Miller, a coward who'd done what he'd done. Miller's whole being crawled with revulsion. If he'd just had a last year to live over again, he thought fervently. And yet through it all, some inner strain kept telling him that he wasn't really dead. This was his own world, all right, and it was essentially unchanged. What happened to it was beyond the pale of mere guesswork. But this one thing began to be clear. This was a world in which change or motion of any kind was a foreigner. Fire wouldn't burn, and smoke didn't rise. Doors wouldn't open, liquids were solid. Miller's stubbing toe would not move a pedal, and a blade of grass easily supported his weight without bending. In other words, Miller began to understand. Change had been stopped as surely as if a master hand had been put a finger on the world's balance wheel. Miller's ramblings were terminated by the consciousness that he had an acute headache. His mouth tasted, as Herman used to say after a big night, as if an army had camped in it. Coffee and a bromo were what he needed, but it was a great awakening to him when he found a restaurant and learned that he could neither drink the coffee nor get the lid off the bromo bottle. Fragrant coffee steam hung over the glass percolator, but even this steam was as a brick wall to his probing touch. Miller started gloomily to thread his way through the waiters in the back of the counter again, and moments later he stood in the street and there were tears swimming in his eyes. "Helen, His voice was a pleading whisper. "Helen, where are you?" There was no answer but the pitiful palpitation of utter silence. And then there was a movement at Dave Miller's right. Something shot from between the parked cars and crashed against him. Something brown and hairy and soft. It knocked him down. Before he could get his breath, a red, wet tongue was licking his face and hands, and he was looking up into the face of a police dog. Frantic with joy at seeing another in this city of death, the dog would scarcely let Miller rise. It stood up to plant big paws on his shoulders and try to lick his face. Miller laughed aloud, a laugh with a throaty catch in it. "Where'd you come from, boy? Won't they talk to you either? What's your name, boy?" There was a heavy, brass-studded collar about the animal's neck, and Dave Miller read on its little nameplate, Major. "Well, Major, at least we've got company now," was Miller's sigh of relief. For a long time he was too busy with the dog to bother about the sobbing noises. Apparently the dog failed to hear them, for he gave no sign, and Miller scratched him behind the ear. "What shall we do now, Major? Walk? Maybe your nose can smell out another friend for us." They'd hardly gone 2 blocks when it came to him that there was a more useful way of spending their time, in the library. Half convinced that the whole trouble stemmed from what he'd done earlier, which any evidence was conspicuously absent now. He decided that a perusal of the surgery books in the public library might yield something he'd use. That way they bent their steps, and were soon mounting the broad cement stairs of the building. As they went beneath the brass turnstile, the librarian caught Miller's attention with a smiling glance, and he smiled back. "I'm trying to find something on brain surgery. With a shock then, he realized he'd been talking to himself. In the next instant Dave Miller whirled, and a voice from the bookcases chuckled. "If you find anything, I wish you'd let me know. I'm stumped myself." From a corner of the room came an elderly, half-bald man with tangled grey brows and a rueful smile. A pencil was balanced over his ear, and a notebook was clutched in his hand. "You too! I had hoped I was the only one." Miller went forward hurriedly to grip his hand. "I'm afraid I'm not so unselfish. I've been hoping for 2 hours that I'd run into some other poor soul." Wait, no, that was Dave talking. "I'm afraid I'm not so unselfish. I've been hoping for 2 hours that I'd run into some other poor soul." "Quite understandable, but in my case it's different. You see, I'm responsible for this whole tragic business." "You? I thought—" The man wagged his head, staring at his notepad, which was littered with jumbled calculations. Miller had a chance to study him. He was tall, heavily built, with wide, sturdy shoulders, despite his 60 years. Oddly, he wore a grey-green smock, and his eyes, narrowed and intent, looked gimlet-sharp beneath those toothbrush brows of his as he stared at the pad. "There's the trouble, right there. I provided only 3 stages of amplification, whereas 4 would have been barely enough. No wonder the phase didn't carry through." "I guess I don't follow you. You mean something you did?" I should think it's something I did." The baldish stranger scratched his head with the tip of his pencil. "I'm John Erickson. You know, the Wanamaker Institute?" "Oh." Erickson was the head of the Wanamaker Institute, first laboratory of them all when it came to exploding atoms and blazing trails into the wildernesses of science. Erickson's piercing eyes were suddenly boring into the younger man. "You've been sick, haven't you?" "Well, no, not really sick. I'll admit to being drunk a few hours ago, though." "You're drunk?" Erickson stuck his tongue in his cheek and shook his head and scowled. "No, that would hardly do it. There must have been something else. The impulsor isn't that powerful. I can understand about the dog, poor fellow. He must have been been run over, and I caught him just at the instant of passing from life to death." "Oh." Dave Miller lifted his head, knowing now what Erickson was driving at. "Well, I may as well be frank. Well, I was very drunk. Let me beat around the bush. Hasn't been anything like I've done in my family for centuries. Took a skinful of liquor to set the precedent, you see." "Well, perhaps we'll find the precedent hasn't really been set, but no matter." His lifted hand stopped Miller's eager, wondering exclamation. "The point is, young man, we three are in a tough spot, and it's up to us to get out of it. And not only we, but heaven knows how many others the world over." "Would you, maybe you can explain to my lame mind what's happened?" "Of course, forgive me. You see, Mr. Miller. Dave Miller. Dave it is. I have a feeling we're going to be pretty well educated and antiquated before this is over. You see, Dave, I'm not on so-called time theories. I've seen time compared to everything from an entity to a long pink worm. But I disagree with them all because they postulate the idea that time's constantly being manufactured. Such reasoning, it's quite fantastic, you see. Time exists, not as an ever-growing chain of links, because such a chain would have to have a tail end if it has a front end, and who could imagine the period when time did not exist? So I think time is like a circular train track, unending. We who live and die merely travel around on it. The future exists simultaneously with the past for one instant when they meet, you see." Miller's brain was humming. Erickson shot the words at him staccato fashion, as if they were things known from great primer days, and the young druggist scratched his head. "You got me licked. I'm a stranger here myself." "No, naturally, you can't be expected to understand things I've been puzzling all my life about. Simplest way I can explain it is that we are on a train following this immense circular railway. When the train reaches the point where it started, it's about to plunge to the past, but that's impossible because the point where it started is simply the caboose of the train, and that point's always ahead and behind the time train. Now, my idea was with the popular stimulus, a man could be thrust across the diameter of this circular railway to a point in his past, you see. Because of the nature of time, he can neither go ahead of the train to meet the future, nor could he stand still and let the caboose catch up with him. But he could detour across the circle and land farther back on the train. And that, my dear Dave, is what you and I and Major have done. Well, almost. Almost. We are somewhere part way across the space between present and past. We're living in an instant that can move neither forward nor back. You and I, Dave, and Major, and heaven knows how many the others the world over have been thrust by my time impulsor, into a timeless beach of eternity. We've been caught in time's backwash, castaways, you might say." An objection clamored for attention in Miller's mind. "But if this is so, where are the rest of them? Where's my wife?" "They're right here. No doubt you could see your wife if you could find her. But we see them as statues because for us, well, time no longer exists. There was something I didn't count on. I didn't know it would be possible to live in one small instant of time as we're doing. I didn't know that those who only were hovering between life and death can deviate from the normal process of time." "You mean we're dead?" Miller's voice was a bitter monotone. "Obviously not. We're talking and moving, aren't we? But we are on the fence. When I gave my impulsor the jolt of high power, it went wrong, and I think something must have happened to me. At the same instant, you must have had your, unfortunate interaction." Perhaps, Dave, you are dying. The only way for us to find out is get the machine working and topple ourselves one way or the other. If we fall back, we'll all live. If we fall into the present, well, we may die. Either way, it's better than this. I came to the library here, hoping to find out the things I must know, and my own books are locked in my study,
and these they might be cemented in their places, for all they used to be. I suppose we might as well go back to the lab. Maybe you'll get an idea when you look at the machine again. Let's hope so. Heaven knows I failed so far.
Alright, folks. So, as usual, it's been about an hour, so we're going to take a short intermission. Now would be a great time to get up, stretch your legs, snag some water, maybe some food if you get the calories lying around. And we'll be back momentarily with the third chapter of this book. Welcome back. Hope you had a nice little intermission there. Let's get back right into it with chapter 3. It was a solid hour's walk out to the West Wilshire, where the laboratory was. The immense bronze and glass doors of Wanamaker Institute were closed, and so barred to the two men, but Erickson led the way down the side.
We can get in the service door, and then we climb through transoms and ventilators until we get to my lab.
Major frisked along beside them. He was enjoying the action and the companionship. It was less of an adventure to Miller, who knew death might be ahead for three of them. Two workmen were moving a heavy cabinet in the side service door. To get in, they climbed to the back of the rear workman, walked across the cabinet, and scaled down to the front of the leading man. They went up to the stairs of the 15th floor, and here they crawled through a transom into the wing marked Experimental, enter only by appointment. Major was helped through it, and then they were crawling along the dark metal tunnel of an air-conditioning ventilator. It was small and took some wriggling. In the next room they were confronted by a stern receptionist on whose desk was a little brass sign reading, "Have you an appointment?" Miller had always had his share of experience with receptionist ways in his days as a pharmaceutical salesman. He took the greatest pleasure now in lighting his cigarette from a match struck on this girl's nose. Then he blew the smoke in her face and hastened to crawl through the final transom. John Erickson's laboratory was well lighted by a glass brick wall and a huge skylight. The sun's rays glinted on the time impulsor. The scientist explained the impulsor in concise terms, and when he had finished, Dave Miller knew just as little as before, and the outfit still resembled three transformers in a line, of the type seen on power poles, connected to a great bronze globe hanging from the ceiling.
"There's the monster that put us in this plight," Erickson grunted. "Too strong to be legal and too weak to do the job right. Take a good look."
With his hands jammed in his pockets, he frowned at the complex machinery. Miller stared for a few moments, then transferred his interest to other things in the room. He was immediately struck by the resemblance of a transformer in the far corner to the ones linked up with the impulsor.
What's that? It looks the same as the ones you used over there." "It is. But didn't you say all you needed was another stage of power?" "That's right." "Well, maybe I'm crazy."
Miller stared from the impulsor to the transformer and back again.
"Why don't you use it then?"
"Using what for the connection?"
"Why, of course."
The scientist jerked a thumb at a small bale of heavy copper wire.
"Bring it over and we'll try it."
Miller was halfway over to it when he was brought up short, and a sheepish grin spread over his features.
"I get it. The bale of wire might as well be the Empire State Building as far as we're concerned. Forgive my stupidity."
Erickson suddenly became serious.
"I like to be optimistic, Dave, but in all fairness to you, I must tell you I see no way out of this. The machine is, of course, still working. With that extra stage of power, the uncertainty would be over. But where in the world of immovable things will we find a piece of wire 25 feet long?"
There was a warm, moist sensation against Miller's hand, and when he looked down, Major stared up at him commiseratingly. Miller scratched him behind the ear, and the dog closed his eyes, reassured and happy. The young druggist sighed, wishing there were some giant hand to scratch him behind the ear and smooth his troubles over.
"And I suppose if we don't get out, we'll starve to death, I suppose."
"No, I don't think that'll be that quick. I haven't felt any hunger, and I don't expect to. After all, our bodies are still living in one instance of time, and a man can't work up a healthy appetite in 1 second." Of course, this elastic second business precludes the possibility of disease. Our bodies must go on unchanged. The only hope I see is when we are on the verge of madness. The standard way of getting out for a madman. Poison. The usual things, all the usual wherewithal, they're denied to us, so we'd have to go the hard way with a lot of kinetic energy, if you catch my drift.
Black despair closed down on Dave Miller, and he thrust it back, forcing a crooked grin.
Let's make a bargain. When we finish fooling around with the apparatus, we split up. We'll only be at each other's throat if we stick together. I'll be blaming you for my plight, and I don't want to. It's my fault just as much as yours. How about it? You're all right, Dave, Erickson said, gripping his hand. Let me give you some advice. If you ever do get back to the present, keep away from the liquor. Liquor and you folks, they never did mix. You'll have that store on its feet again in no time. Thanks. I think I can promise that nothing less than a whiskey antidote for a snake bite will ever make me bend an elbow again.
For the next couple of hours, despondency reigned in the laboratory, but it was soon to be deposed again by hope. Despite all of Erickson's scientific training, it was Dave Miller himself who grasped the down-to-earth idea that started them hoping again. He was walking about the lab, jingling keys in his pocket, when suddenly he stopped short, and he jerked the ring of keys into his hand. Erickson, we've been blind. Look at this. The scientist looked, but he remained puzzled. Well, there's a wire. You got keys, I've got keys. We got coins, knives, and wristwatches. Why can't we lay them all end to end? And Erickson's features looked as if he'd been electrically shocked. You hit it, if we've got enough. With one accord, they began emptying their pockets, tearing off wristwatches, searching for pencils. The finds made a little heap in the middle of the floor, and Erickson let his long fingers claw through thin hair. Oh, heaven give us enough. We'll only need the one wire. Things are already plugged in already, and only the positive pole has to be connected to the globe. Come on! Scooping up the assortment of metal articles, they rushed across the room, and with his pocket knife, Dave Miller began breaking up the metal wristwatch straps, opening the links out so they could be laid end to end for the greatest possible length. They patiently broke the watches to pieces, and of the junk they garnered made a ragged 1.5 feet of wire. The coins stretched the line still further. They had 10 feet covered before the stuff was half used up. Their metal pencils, taken apart, gave them a good 2 feet. Keychains helped generously. With 18 feet covered, their progress began to slow down, and perspiration poured down Miller's face. Desperately, he tore off his large ring and cut it in two to pound it flat. From garters and suspenders they went a few inches more, and then they stopped, feet from their goal. Miller groaned, and he tossed his pocket knife in his hand. We could still get a foot out of this, but that still leaves us way short. Shoes! They're full of nails. Get to work with that knife, Dave. We'll cut out every one of them. In 10 minutes their shoes were reduced to ragged piles of tattered leather, and Erickson's deft fingers painstakingly placed the nails one by one in a line, and the distance left to cover was less than 6 inches. He lined up the last few nails, then both men were sinking back on their heels as they saw there was a gap of 3 inches to cover. Beaten by 3 inches. 3 inches from the present, and it might as well be 1,000,000 miles. Miller's body felt as though it were in a vice, and his muscles ached with the strain. So taut were his nerves that he leaped as though stung when Major nuzzled a cool nose into his hand again, and automatically he began to stroke the dog's neck. Well, that licks us. There isn't another piece of movable metal in the world. Major kept whimpering and pushing against him, and annoyed the druggist shoved him away. No way, I don't feel like... And then suddenly his eyes widened as his touch encountered warm metal, and he whirled. There it is. Less like the nameplate on Major's collar. In a flash he'd torn the little rectangular brass plate from the dog collar, and Erickson took it from his grasp. Sweat stood shiny on his skin, and he held the bit of metal over the gap between the wire and pole. This is it. We're on our way, Dave. Where, I don't know. To death or back to life, but wherever we are, we're going. The metal clinked into place, and live, writhing power leapt through the wire, snarling across partial breaks. The transformers began to hum, and the humming grew louder. Singing softly, the bronze globe over their heads glowed green. Dave Miller felt a curious lightness. There was a snap in his brain, and Erickson, Major, in the laboratory faded from his senses. Then came an interval when the only sound was the soft sobbing he'd been hearing, as if in a dream. That and darkness that enfolded him like soft velvet. Then Miller was opening his eyes to see the familiar walls of his own kitchen around him. And someone cried out, "Dave! Oh, Dave, dear!" It was Helen's voice, and it was Helen who cradled his head in her lap and bent his face close to his. "Oh, thank heavens that you're alive!"
"Yeah, Helen, what are you doing here?"
"I couldn't go through with it. I just couldn't leave you. And I came back, and I heard the shot and ran in. The doctor should be here. I called him 5 minutes ago."
5 minutes? How long has it been since I...
"Oh, just 6 or 7 minutes. I called the doctor right away." Miller took a deep breath. Then it must have been a dream. All that to happen in a few minutes. It wasn't possible.
How could have I botched that? I wasn't drunk enough to miss, was I?
"Oh, that old 45 of grandfather's, it hasn't been loaded since the Civil War. I guess the powder got damp or something. It just sort of sputtered instead of exploding properly. Dave, promise me something. You won't ever do anything like this again if I promise not to nag." Dave closed his eyes.
"There won't be any need to nag, Helen. Some people take a lot of teaching, but I've had my lesson. Got my ideas about the store, which I've been too lazy to try out. I feel more like fighting now than I have for years. Well, look, I'm well beyond."
Helen buried her face in the hollow of his shoulder and cried softly. Her words were too muffled to be intelligible, but Dave Miller understood what she meant. He had thought the whole thing a dream. John Erickson, the Time Impulsor, and Major. But that night he read an item in the Evening Courier that was to keep him thinking for many days.
"Police investigate the death of a scientist here in the laboratory. John M. Erickson, director of the Wanamaker Institute, died at his work last night. Erickson was a beloved and valuable figure in the world of science, famous for his recently published time-lapse theory. 2 strange circumstances surrounded his death. One was the presence of a German Shepherd dog in the laboratory, its head crushed as if with a sledgehammer, and the other was a chain of small metal objects stretching from one corner of the room to the other, as if intended to take the place of a wire in a circuit. Police, however, discount this idea as there was a roll of wire only a few feet from the body."
That's the end of the story, but there seems to be a footnote. This footnote was in reference to the Time Impulsor. Obviously, this electric Time Impulsor is a machine in the nature of an atomic integrator. It broadcasts great waves of electrons, which align all atomic objects in rigid suspension. That is to say, atomic structures are literally frozen. Living bodies are similarly affected. It's a widely held belief on the part of many eminent scientists that all matter, broken down into its elementary atomic composition, is electrical in structure. That being so, there is no reason to suppose why Professor Erickson may not have discovered a time impulsor which, broadcasting electric impulses, froze everything within its range. And that's from the editor. Interesting. This was actually, look at there. This was from an Astounding Stories from the 50s that didn't get the copyright renewed on. So we're still reading these Astounding Stories, huh? We really never are going to get away from those, I guess. But that was the day time stopped moving. Got a little heavy there at the beginning. Sorry about that, but hopefully I'll have the wherewithal to remember to let you know when to skip to if you wanted to avoid the, how shall I put this gently, objectionable scene. If not, I'm glad you stuck around either way. I do have a few things to plug before we end in the episode for the evening. I do this on Friday nights live on Twitch. On Wednesday evenings live on Twitch I do a variety stream. It's usually video games, but sometimes it's something else. I usually have a piece of original content that goes up around the afternoon on Mondays. That's going to be put on hold as soon as the current episode of Frozen Tundra Finds Upcoming gets published, but I won't go too deeply into detail on that. You'll need to go watch the episode of Frozen Tundra Finds that's Balloon Fight to learn just what's up for the coming months. Other than that, the archives for this stream, as you know, go up on Thursdays, and the archives for the Wednesday streams go up on Saturday, both at varying degrees of delay. And then I do something on Sunday called LGBT&D with a couple of other streamer pals of mine, and we play Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a great time. And between all those things that I do, I have stuff every day of the week except Tuesday, so you've got plenty to catch up on. Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.